4 millennia before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Order would be torn apart by 2 of their best. Arca Jeth and Vodosiask Bas, both among the most respected Jedi Masters of their time, had trained the infamous Jedi Knights Ulic Qel-Droma and Exar Kun respectively, the instigators of the Great Sith War. With the sorceress Alima Keto and the warlord Mandalore the Indomitable by their side, the pair made war on the Republic and the Jedi. In response, the Jedi Nomi Sunrider, the most gifted Force wielder of her generation, would spearhead the effort to take the fight back to the Sith. One of her greatest allies was the Cathar Jedi Knight, Sylvar. Although the Jedi Code would eventually forbid the taking of multiple Padawans, in those days it was not uncommon for a teacher to take more than one student, nor for Jedi to marry or have children. Alongside Exar Kun, Sylvar had been one of the apprentices of the Jedi weapons master Vodosiask Bas, and had trained on Dantooine. She had also fallen in love with Credo, a fellow male Cathar whom she eventually took as her mate. Her world turned in upon itself when Exar Kun fell to the dark side, for when the offer to join his Sith forces came, Credo answered the call. Though Sylvar would go on to play a great part in the fight against the Sith, having repelled an assassination attempt on the life of Jedi Master Thawne, capturing Oswillum in the process, and assisting Nomi Sunrider in the final defeat of Ulic Qel-Droma and Exar Kun, Sylvar had also been one of the Jedi who had lost the most by the war's end. Her Jedi Master had been killed by Exar Kun personally, and Credo had been an inconsequential casualty in a greater scheme carried out by both Kun and Qel-Droma, a plot which had resulted in the death of the treacherous Alima Keto, and opened the door to the cataclysmic Sith attack on the planet Ossus. While Qel-Droma had been cut off from the Force by Nomi Sunrider, and the spirit of Exar Kun imprisoned within a great wall of light, Sylvar never felt as though true justice had been done. Emotions such as love and hate held equal value for the Cathar people, and so despite the fact that many of their Force-sensitive children would go on to join the ranks of the Jedi, the Order's teachings and philosophy often clashed with their natural instincts and cultural identity. A race of predators that hailed from a planet dominated by wild savannas, the Cathar built their cities amidst gigantic trees. The Cathar people dwelled within the enormous trees, which they adorned with elaborate carvings and murals. Epics which depicted great successes, as well as great failures. In the eyes of his fellow Cathar, Credo's story served as a cautionary tale. And while the people looked to Sylvar as their representative within the Jedi Order, she began to feel isolated and hopeless over the decade which followed Exar Kun's defeat, the adoration she received from her people notwithstanding. When 2 members of the Cathar people mated, they did so for life, even in the event of the death of their chosen mate. Because of this, she would never know love following the loss of Credo. She would never have children of her own. Sylvar placed the blame for all this squarely upon Ulic Qel-Droma. In her eyes, the murderer of her mate and a war criminal who had been allowed to go free. When her calls for retribution at the Jedi rally held on Ex's station went unanswered, Sylvar took matters into her own hands and tried to murder Qel-Droma on Renvar. It was there that Qel-Droma had been secretly guiding the Jedi training of Vima Sunrider, the daughter of Nomi, who had used her powers to cut Qel-Droma off from the Force just prior to the war's end. Following a protracted lightsaber duel, Ulic Qel-Droma admitted to the part he played in the war which had destroyed Sylvar's life. But he also rightfully pointed out that Credo had made his own choices, as Sylvar would now have to do for herself. Breaking off from the engagement, Keldroma deactivated his weapon. In doing so, he convinced Sylvar to stand down, forcing her to realize that by giving in to her emotions, she had very nearly taken the same path he had. In leaving himself open to Sylvar's blade, Ulic Keldroma had achieved his final redemption, and opened the door for Sylvar's own. He was murdered shortly thereafter by Hagen, a hapless scavenger and fanatic follower of the Jedi, all too eager to please. Ulic Keldroma became one with the Force, despite having been cut off from it for so many years. As Vima Sunrider told her mother, he still had the heart of a Jedi. As for Sylvar, she had finally come full circle, her soul and devotion to the light still intact. Because of Ulic Keldroma, she had at last found peace. She had let go of her anger. Credo's fall to darkness had been deeply alarming to the Cathar people, but they took comfort and strength in the resolve of his mate, who remained on the path of light. Sylvar became a standard around which her people felt they could rally, a living legend, a symbol of what it was possible for their Force-sensitive young to achieve. Despite never having children of her own, Sylvar's influence would persist for generations to come. Almost 30 centuries later, a new threat rose against the Republic. The Sith of old had been plagued by destructive infighting and devious self-sabotage at the expense of their own order, and with this realization in mind, a great force of Sith led by the Dark Lord Khan formed a new order. One allegedly built upon a foundation of cooperation, a brotherhood of darkness, galvanized as one and mobilized against the Republic. But all of that was before the coming of Darth Bane. Bane had progressed quickly through the ranks of the Sith military before his superiors discovered his depth in the Force. Recognizing the extent of his untapped power, he had been sent for Sith training on the planet Korriban. There, Bane's initial meteoric rise was abruptly halted after he experienced a shameful defeat at the hands of his rival, the Zabrak apprentice, Sirak. His humiliation had been so complete that he fell out of favor with every instructor and fellow student based at the academy, as they believed he was beneath their notice, something even he began to believe in his weaker moments. At around this time, the academy welcomed a new student for training, the latest discovery of Lord Khan. An ambitious former Padawan, Githany had turned her back on the light in favor of the promises hidden within the dark. Like Bane before her, Githany was sent to Korriban to complete her training under the Sith Masters. She quickly became a favorite of the Masters and the envy of her peers. However, Githany realized that she could not defeat Sirak, the Academy's top apprentice, all on her own, and so she had turned her attention to Bane. She would forge him into a weapon which once honed could be unleashed upon Sirak and any other rivals. However, Bane was not blind to this. Both needed each other, and both used each other to get what the other wanted. They also cared for one another, inasmuch as two Sith were able to. Githany used her knowledge of both Jedi and Sith techniques to aid Bane in recovering his fighting spirit. In time, the young man grew stronger than either could have imagined. Fate and circumstance eventually placed the two on divergent paths. Enthralled by the charismatic and powerful Lord Khan, Githany remained within his sway, though Bane grew increasingly disillusioned with the Brotherhood, viewing it as a perversion of the true way of the Sith. Following 2 failed attempts on his life, one carried out by Githany herself, Darth Bane rejoined the Sith forces on Ruusan under the pretense of making peace. In truth, he had arrived to complete his work. His vision for the future of the Sith did not allow for the continued existence of the Brotherhood. For the Order to survive and thrive, no more than 2 Sith could ever exist at any one time. One master to embody the power, and one apprentice to crave it. The rule of 2. Realizing that Khan had placed his followers on a path of ruin, Bane reached out to Githany one final time, urging her to become his apprentice. When she refused him, he turned his back on her for good, recognizing that she had never truly understood the dark side. Darth Bane tricked Khan into utilizing a dangerous dark side ritual known as the Thought Bomb, a weapon which specifically targeted those who could touch the Force, Jedi and Sith alike. Khan's madness finally became obvious to Githany. With the scales pulled from her eyes, she now saw the desperate fool for what he was. Hoping to rekindle what she once had with Bane and become his new apprentice, Githany fled in terror. Having found himself cornered by a contingent of Jedi, Khan triggered the Thought Bomb, which once unleashed, wiped out nearly every Force user on Ruusan, including Githany. We'll start with an examination of their physical attributes. The Jedi Knight Sylvar was a Cathar female, a common enough sight within the Jedi Order of the Old Republic. Tall, muscular, and feline in appearance, members of the Cathar species aged at the same rate as humans. By the time she challenged Ulic Qel-Droma on Renvar, Sylvar would still have been in the prime of her life, having only completed her training as a Padawan a mere decade or so earlier. As such, she was tough, quick, and possessed of great endurance. During her blood hunt, a cleansing ritual unique to her people, which she took part in during a failed attempt to let go of her anger, Sylvar demonstrated greatly enhanced physical speed and strength. She single-handedly slaughtered an entire colony of Kiltics, the large insectoid species which routinely terrorized her people. Most notably, she did so without tiring. She also perceived and attacked a pursuing messenger she had taken for a spy, a male of her own species, and casually lifted him above her head, a notable, if mundane, feat of strength. Characteristic of her species, her augmented auditory and olfactory senses outstripped her human counterparts and made her a very capable hunter and tracker. Cathar also possessed natural retractable claws. This trait, coupled with their cultural passion for combat, gave the species as a whole an excellent reputation for being able to hold their own in a fight. The claws could be used to deal death blows to both their enemies and their prey, a prominent feature in Sylvar's case, as she used her claws to kill her prey during her blood hunt, and years earlier used the claws to fatally wound Exar Kun's Massassi warriors, tearing out their throats. Because of their claws, Cathar were always considered to be armed in the minds of other species. When bereft of her lightsaber, Sylvar did not hesitate to draw on this ability, and at times she even used her claws in conjunction with her blade, or else to humiliate her most bitter rivals, such as her former lover Credo, or more notably Exar Kun. Exar Kun's highly recognizable facial scars were given to him by none other than Sylvar herself. Sylvar was also quite physically resilient. She's recovered from being sent reeling by Exar Kun's force waves, and she's even survived being beaten into submission by an overwhelming force of Massassi warriors, at least one of whom had been physically augmented using a ritual devised by the ancient Sith sorcerers. Githany was strikingly beautiful. That's honestly the most emphasized aspect of her physicality. Githany has very few notable showings. She once reached out and grabbed a bat as it flew through the air and crushed it in her clenched fist, though she did so only after having been attacked by a swarm of bats, so a cynical perspective on the issue could lead one to suggest she could have almost done this by accident. But let's not be cynical. To her credit, she did also recover from the attack fairly well, considering the cuts and bites inflicted upon her by the animals. Githany has also been noted for her speed, as she once moved quickly enough to dispatch one of the Jedi based on Ruusan with her lightsaber. However, the Jedi were in very dire straits during this period of their history. The Army of Light had begun to recruit initiates specifically to be trained and put into service in the war. This is actually how the cousins Bug, Tomcat, and Rain, the latter of whom eventually became Darth Zana, found themselves on Ruusan in the first place. They had intended to meet up with the Army of Light, despite their status as complete and total neophytes. So, although speed blitzing a Jedi does indeed sound impressive, I'm not certain how much stock I'd place in this singular feat. After all, the Jedi's companion was a child or young teen that Darovit of all people killed with equal ease. Even amongst the Jedi of this era, these two guys clearly weren't the cream of the crop. Finally, and definitely most notably, Githany survived being in close proximity to an explosion which occurred when her speeder bike was shot out of the sky by Valentine Farfalla's forces. She also recovered from the fall which accompanied this and proceeded to engage in a duel immediately after, a duel which she also won. This one seems fairly easy to call to me. Sylvar is at least as fast and agile, if not more so, appears to be physically stronger on the basis of what we've observed, and has alternative weaponry in the form of her claws which render unarmed strikes incredibly lethal. By comparison, Githany really isn't offering anything worth considering. Sylvar gets the decisive physical edge. Sylvar has been described in several sources as a powerful Jedi. Without any context, that is an incredibly vague designation. However, I'll do my best to extrapolate how she attained this reputation based on what little can be observed. As previously stated, Sylvar was capable of augmenting her physical abilities to quite a high degree. In addition to the feats I mentioned earlier, she broke through Exar Kun's defenses, albeit recklessly leaving herself open to a counterattack in the process. Granted, I'm not saying this was her baseline speed. It clearly wasn't, and she may have even drawn upon the dark side to achieve this feat, as she had been angry with Exar Kun throughout the contest. But still, this is well worth considering, not so much because of what she did, but rather whom she did it to. Additionally, when Exar Kun finally fell to the dark side, the impact of this sent a wave throughout the galaxy which Jedi who were sensitive enough could feel. Sylvar was able to immediately identify the dark presence in the Force as Exar Kun himself, without the need for her master to confirm the truth. Years later, during her quest for revenge, she could also sense Ulic Qel-Droma's presence, claiming it to be like a beacon to her, despite the fact that at that point in time, Qel-Droma's ability to feel or manipulate the Force had been entirely diminished. When Vima Sunrider's starship was nearly dragged into a sun, the ship's hull began to melt before Taut Danita came to her rescue. While in attendance at the Jedi rally on Exus Station, Sylvar sensed the disturbance in the Force, which alerted her to the danger Vima Sunrider was faced with. Curiously, Sylvar had noted the specific presence of fire and the fact that someone was approaching a massive source of heat against their will. This would suggest that Sylvar may have even been sensitive to Vima's thoughts. She had detailed knowledge of the impending danger without actually witnessing the ordeal, rather than the more commonplace and vague warnings the Jedi so often perceived through the Force. When considering the three branches of Force study, control, sense, and alter, the evidence strongly suggests that Sylvar may have placed an emphasis of her training on sense powers. As she was a highly dedicated warrior, it would stand to reason that she would rely on these sorts of insights to better respond to, or maybe even anticipate the actions of her adversaries. In her own way, this would give her some commonality with other revered alien Jedi, such as the Togruta Jedi Master Shaak-Ti, the Nautolan Kit Fisto, or even lesser-known figures such as the Ithorian Raron Korob, all of whom used the Force to amplify the abilities shared by all members of their species. It's also worth noting that both Shaak-Ti and Kit Fisto in particular were good at taking stock of their surroundings and taking on hordes of opponents on their lonesome, something Sylvar also excelled at. Now, it would be going a bit far for me to state that she stood on a level with Shaak-Ti or Kit Fisto in this regard with any real degree of certainty. But I do think it's reasonable to conclude that Sylvar's talents did lie in that direction. In a departure from these much more passive abilities, Sylvar seemed capable of influencing the emotions of others, even if in a detrimental or perhaps even unintended fashion. When she traveled with her fellow Jedi Knight, Tat Dunita, to the Twi'lek homeworld of Ryloth, Sylvar had been presented with an axe and asked to assist in the physical labor necessary to repair the damage wrought by a long-standing conflict between two rival clans. As a prideful warrior, Sylvar asserted that she could offer greater assistance if they allowed her to lead them into battle against their enemies. She was on the verge of inciting a violent riot from the gathered Twi'leks, all of whom had begun to agree with what she had to say, and the mayhem was only avoided when Tat Donita intervened. Keeping in mind the long-standing nature of this destructive rivalry, in other words, the fact that it was not a new outrage, but merely the latest in a series of transgressions that had been going on for generations, I am inclined to think that Sylvar held influence over the crowd, at least to some degree. The rapidity with which the crowd shifted in demeanor and unquestioningly took up their arms in the full expectation of sharing in Sylvar's bloodlust was all rather startling. It's possible her presence in the Force may have had the capability to have a corrupting influence on those around her. Empathic sensitivity and manipulation are as possible for the Jedi as more commonplace mind tricks. It is worth noting that when another Cathar Jedi named Githany fell to the dark side, her influence held a corrupting presence in the Force a short distance away from the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine. When left unchecked, this dark taint influenced the flora and fauna that inhabited the grove which Githany had claimed for her own. Perhaps this curious effect is linked to the intense passions which characterize every member of the Cathar people, whether strong in the Force or not. However, this is merely speculative on my part. During the war against the Sith, Sylvar also actively offered up her own reserves of Force power to bolster the efforts of another Jedi on 2 separate occasions. She aided both Vodo Siask Bas in this manner when he struck out against Ulic Qel-Droma, and later added her powers to those of Nomi Sunrider when the latter used the Force to imprison the spirit of Exar Kun within a great wall of light. These powers were not abilities she was credited with having any personal facility with, however, and are not powers I would expect her to be able to bring to bear in this or any other confrontation. Sylvar also appeared to possess some skill with Force stealth. The Cathar people possessed the capacity for natural camouflage, and Githany in particular could even use the Force to bend light around her, making her effectively invisible. I'm not certain whether Sylvar took this ability to the same advanced level that Githany did, but she did turn the tables on the messenger who had been following her, catching him unawares, and she also remained undetected on Renvar until she provoked a lightsaber duel with Ulic Qel-Droma. While Ulic himself was at that time deaf to the Force, she likely would have needed to hide her presence and intentions from Nomi Sunrider, who had come to the world in search of her daughter, Vima. Now, despite what little we know for certain, or the possibilities I've been able to infer, Sylvar was definitely not a dedicated Force wielder by any stretch of the imagination. However, given what can be concluded, I can envision her living up to her reputation as a powerful Jedi Knight quite comfortably. What I cannot do is envision a circumstance where much of this would come into play during a fight. Beyond her formidable sense talents, some of which remain at least partially theoretical on my part, the only abilities she has that are likely to come into play during a fight are again her highly developed skills with physical augmentation. Githany was sent to the Sith Academy on Korriban for training. During the era in which she lived, it was stressed to those accepted into the Academy that each and every one of them was special. The Academy on Korriban was reserved only for those few who had the potential to become true Sith Masters in full. Not merely warriors or assassins, but true Dark Lords of the Sith. As such, Githany's potential was actually the most notable thing about her where the topic of strength in the Force was concerned. Despite her former status as a Jedi, she was described as having been born to the dark side, and virtually every Sith Master she came into contact with saw a great deal of potential in her. In truth, however, she never really got to hone or exercise her abilities in the way one might expect for somebody with her reputation. While it's true that Githany functioned as Darth Bane's teacher for all intents and purposes prior to the defeat of Sirak, the entire reason behind this dynamic of their relationship stemmed from the fact that she doubted her own abilities. Githany knew she was no match for Sirak on her own. The text of Path of Destruction described a training session to which only the top apprentices at the Academy had been admitted. Master Qordis had instructed them in the principles of how to summon lightning, but even Sirak, the greatest student at the Academy, only managed a feeble display of power on that first day. Yet in his first hour, Bane was capable of summoning a maelstrom of dark, crackling energy, the likes of which Githany could only marvel at. Furthermore, she has never been observed using Force lightning on any occasion, not even during her instruction of Bane. Githany was a capable user of telekinesis, however, having used it to subdue an opponent without the consistent need to perform hand gestures, though the specific opponent in question was decidedly low level. She also relied on telekinesis to a great extent when it came to the manipulation of her chosen weapon, the Light Whip. Githany was sensitive to the currents of the Force in a more broad sense and experienced a vision of Darth Bane bringing destruction to the Brotherhood. While not a combative ability, I do consider it further proof of her depth in the Force and her potential for growth, which went untapped due to her untimely death. Additionally, Githany retained some of the benefits of her Jedi training, which had, oddly enough, been conducted by yet another Cathar Jedi, a Cathar male named Handa. When Githany was very young, she had lost touch with the Force, her mind erecting mental barriers to shield herself from something she perceived to be too vast and infinite to comprehend. Master Handa taught her how to reconnect with the Force, a skill she used to reawaken the dormant passions and power that Sirak had very nearly beaten out of Darth Bane. Githany also added her powers to those of Darth Bane, who used his knowledge of an ancient Sith ritual to unleash a violent storm upon Ruusan's forestry by feeding off the powers of the other Dark Lords present. Ironically enough, the most extreme applications of the Force that either participated in were actually intense group efforts directed by another, more powerful and versatile Force wielder who funneled the strength of their allies into a single, focused attack. Because of the differences between Jedi and Sith training, Sith typically offer greater variety and magnitude of combative ability. However, in this particular case, we're dealing with a mere Sith student, one who had the Dark Lord title passed out to her like a party favor. I'm not saying that this is where I think Githany would have remained had she lived on. Quite the opposite. I'm sure she was more powerful than she ever got the opportunity to prove. However, at the stage in her development which we must take into account, she's decidedly limited. Githany's uses of telekinesis have been too subtle and low profile for me to think that they'll have any bearing on this fight. It is true that Sylvar was once incapacitated by a force push, but this was a direct blast from an amulet-empowered Exar Kun, and even this only halted Sylvar's progress. It didn't actually harm her. However, despite my misgivings regarding Githany's level of skill with either telekinesis or lightning, I am still inclined to award her the edge. Where her lightning was concerned, all we know is that in her own words, she never conjured anything that even approached the majesty of what Bane could unleash during his first training session. At best, I would imagine that her greatest efforts with lightning would produce a similar result to what the Sith Lord Vindican achieved using the power. A carefully timed and calculated, immobilizing blow meant to stagger or impede an advancing enemy. However, its potential use is not to be discounted against a Force wielder as comparatively passive and limited as Sylvar. While there are of course still the benefits of Sylvar's physical augmentation to consider, all of Sylvar's other powers point to a high degree of Force attunement and awareness, not overwhelming combative ability. Overall, Githany gets the edge as a Force wielder. As one of the 3 students apprenticed to Vodo Siask Bas immediately prior to the outbreak of the Great Sith War, Sylvar studied directly under one of the Order's finest lightsaber instructors. She engaged in at least semi-regular sparring matches with the likes of Exar Kun, and on one occasion she even penetrated Kun's defenses, driving her claws deep into his flesh, leaving him with the scars he would bear for the rest of his life. Equipped with a standard lightsaber of nondescript make beyond its usually golden blade, which she later changed to a vivid magenta following the war's end, Sylvar was one of the most enthusiastic combatants among the Jedi Order of her time. Her performance in battle was driven by her powerful and overwhelming emotions and pride. Frequently, she gave herself over to her more primal instincts, dancing dangerously close to the dark side in the process, as her friend Tatunita warned her. Her style was one characterized by vicious, uncompromising, frenzied assaults. For this reason, I am inclined to think that her primary discipline was Juyo, the 7th of the traditional Jedi arts. Juyo was arguably the most dangerous of the lightsaber combat styles practiced by the Jedi. Characterized by spastic, erratic attack sequences, the style was alternatively known as the Ferocity form. Almost purely aggressive in nature, the chaotic and unpredictable style required great discipline to use effectively. Even in the eyes of the Sith, the form was only considered to be properly mastered by those who could control their passions. For the Jedi, use of the form was understandably controversial, as many felt the form violated their code. The power associated with the form therefore came with a great deal of personal risk, and following the war with Khan's Brotherhood, the Jedi Battlemaster, Scarch Vonk, forbade the open study of Juyo. Vonk, who had been the chief lightsaber instructor during Githany's time, went on to vow that she would never again permit the widespread practice of Juyo, as she considered this to be a great factor in the fall of so many knights and Padawans during the recent war with the Sith. The form became a tightly regulated practice, only open to those who had already mastered multiple fighting styles and had been deemed ready to take on the demands of the 7th form by their combat instructors, and this practice endured up to the end of the Jedi Order's Golden Age. Because Sylvar lived about 3,000 years before the institution of this policy, this particular rule may not have applied to her. However, her master was a noted weapons specialist who was considered to have an unparalleled understanding of armed combat, at least by the standard of his time. I am inclined to think that Sylvar inherited a rich and varied education from her famous master. Her willingness to surrender herself over to her emotions and throw herself into the Force indicates possible roots in Shicho, the first of the traditional lightsaber styles. Skill with Juyo would make the use of Shicho in single combat rather obsolete. However, Shicho was one of the forms she may have favored when engaging multiple adversaries, as she did on many occasions. She had two typical modes of attack. One made use of a single-handed grip on her lightsaber hilt as she brandished the weapon about, using it to disarm her opponents while using her free hand to attack her enemy's weak points with her claws. This saw most frequent use during large-scale battles and skirmishes. Her dueling style was markedly different. She made most frequent use of powerful two-handed attacks to hammer her opponent's defenses. When engaging in a lightsaber duel, she fought almost purely offensively, which, along with her tendency to leave herself open to counterattack, plays well with my theory that she specialized with Juyo. However, I also believe she supplemented her practice of Form 7 with one or both applications of Form 5, Shien and/or Gemso, to balance out her defensive capabilities. While I'm not at all certain that she made use of the latter, I believe she did at least utilize Shien when engaging blaster-wielding opponents on chaotic battlefields, as she transitioned into a more calm and defensive posture during such engagements. Skilled with deflection, she effortlessly turned aside blaster bolts fired by her opponents, and while she was quite nimble and swift, she was not a committed acrobat. Sylvar also drove back Ulic Qel-Droma during their duel on Renvar. However, it should be noted that Qel-Droma was fighting almost purely defensively as he refused to retaliate against Sylvar. Even more importantly, he also lacked the ability to draw on the Force during this contest. While it would be very easy to dismiss Sylvar on this basis, I am more inclined to view this as a spectacular achievement of Qel-Droma's, rather than a poor showing of Sylvar's. We must remember that Ulic was one of the two greatest duelists of his generation, and he had successfully instructed Vima Sunrider in the use of a lightsaber, despite his own severed connection to the Force. That Sylvar could pressure such a man without being disarmed or otherwise outmaneuvered does say something about her level of skill, though of course, his ability to hold his own against a Jedi who could make full use of the Force says a great deal more about Ulic Qel-Droma in my opinion. Among her other achievements, Sylvar has cut down Hissis, otherwise known as Darkside Dragons, which had been summoned from beneath Ambria's infamous Lake Nath using Sith techniques. She has also used violent disemboweling maneuvers to take down Mandalorian warriors, and along with her fellow Jedi Knight, Dace Diath, she has even deflected pulse-wave cannon fire with her lightsaber, before ultimately taking down an attacking Basilisk war droid. Overall, Sylvar was quite a dangerous lightsaber duelist, a proud, fearless, and proactive warrior who never hesitated in battle, even when she was outclassed, and willing to do whatever was necessary to take her opponents down as quickly as possible. When Sylvar attacked, she went directly for the jugular, a predator through and through. She's not as likely to remove your hand as she is your head. Perhaps this flew in the face of what the Jedi stood for. No matter the case, it made her a true force to be reckoned with. As one of the top apprentices in attendance at the Sith Academy, Githany was a powerful and skilled student. It was said that the ways of the dark side came naturally to her, and that she had quickly developed a reputation for crushing anybody who got in her way. We don't know exactly how much benefit she took from the brief instruction she enjoyed under the Sith Blade Master Kas'im, and it is likely that she only ever partook in group training sessions. While it is likely she engaged other students at the academy in the dueling ring, and almost certainly won the majority of her duels, as she picked her opponents very carefully and hoped to one day topple the greatest apprentice of her generation, the details of these various contests are completely unknown. Even her chosen martial arts discipline remains unclear. but we do know that in the two sources we have that depict her, she favored the use of the most exotic of all lightsaber designs, the light whip. The light whip functioned along similar principles as the traditional weapon. However, instead of a straight, rigid blade, the energy beams emitted by light whips were long, flexible, and ribbon-like. The beam responded to the wielder's physical motions as well as telekinetic manipulation and could be used to twist, turn, and snap, or even grapple. Most initiates from either camp of Force sensitives were never trained to fight against the rare weapon. As such, light whips represented something of an unknown quantity and would more often than not cause inexperienced duelists to hesitate in their attempts to understand the unusual capabilities of the weapon they were faced with. This often gave wielders of the light whip a psychological edge over their opponents, as they had the added bonuses of fear, surprise, and intimidation on their side. The whip was an almost purely offensive weapon and did not transition well into defensive sequences, as it had to be swung widely and lacked the power of the more traditional energy blades. Although Githany did also carry a traditional blade, she preferred not to use it, eschewing the practicality and versatility of the traditional weapon for the unpredictability of the light whip. Githany typically fought her opponents using only her whip to off-balance, surprise, or harass her opponents from a distance. When Darth Bane and Githany faced Sirak and his two Zabrak followers, Yevra and Loke, Githany succeeded in killing the pair of lesser Zabrak siblings, fighting almost entirely from the sidelines, using her whip to strike at the eyes and face of her opponents. She demonstrated great timing and precision in the use of her weapon, removing the eye of Loke after having already killed another downed opponent who'd been neutralized by Darth Bane, Loke's sister Yevra. The only time where Githany willingly set aside her whip in favor of the more commonplace weapon she carried as a backup was when she used Force-augmented speed to dispatch a young Jedi in a dark, confined cave on Ruusan. And even in that obtrusive dueling ground, she was still able to exercise precise enough control in order to remove Bug's foot. She also struck with enough precision to amputate the right hand of her former lover, the Jedi General Kiel Charney. She then used this event to provoke the Jedi initiate Darovit into finishing off Charney, beginning the young man's ill-fated conversion to the Brotherhood of Darkness. Overall, Githany was a fighter that I view as being far more talented and intuitive in a raw sense than she was methodical or truly refined. Having said that, I do credit her for capitalizing on the benefits of her chosen weapon, while at the same time committing to press on through the limitations the weapon also would have encumbered her with. Neither of these two warriors were true master duelists. However, they both received training from the best duelists of their era, and both lived during times of war. Githany's style was one which was ultimately designed around the intimidatingly unpredictable nature of her weapon, not practicality, and her weapon was known to be less efficient than any of the traditional lightsaber blades. Just like Darth Nihil, her entire fighting style was dictated almost entirely by her unusual choice of weapon, and in Githany's case, this resulted in a calculated risk. And while she was an intelligent and patient conniver, her skills with manipulation and knack for foresight generally did not factor into her combat performance. Unlike Lumaya, for example, Githany never made any notable improvements to her weapon's design either. She represented the complete package that one could expect from a standard wielder of the light whip, for all the good and bad which that entailed. The question of how well Githany's skills as a duelist would measure up against another depend greatly on how susceptible her opponent would be. The accolades and accomplishments associated with any given user of such a radical and unusual weapon or style are not as germane to the issue as one might think. This is because their tendencies in battle are effectively impossible to accurately predict, fluid, unfixed, and inconsistent, possibly by design. Githany's style was just so novel that what really determines the edge here would actually be the level of experience of the opponent she is currently facing. The real question is, would Sylvar be able to contend with the unusual weapon? Sylvar may have given herself over to the reckless abandon commonly associated with the 1st and 7th forms of lightsaber combat, but she also survived one of the most brutal wars in the history of the Jedi Order. While there were indeed extenuating circumstances, and she was certainly not the equal of any, she also benefited from the training passed down by Vodo Siask Bas and survived altercations with both Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma. In my opinion, some of the most invaluable learning experiences any Jedi could ask for. I do believe that Githany's use of a light whip would give Sylvar pause, but ultimately, I view Sylvar as being fearless, skilled, and adaptable enough to at least contend with what Githany is bringing to the table. By popular demand, I shall again provide a visual reference for the way I envision this fight playing out by drawing comparisons between the combat performances of these two with characters from Avatar: The Last Airbender and its continuation, Legend of Korra. In the case of Sylvar vs. Githany, I believe the fight would play out much like the fight between the Firebender Mako and the Waterbender Ming Hua, though taking both their initial bout and their eventual rematch into account. I believe Githany, represented by Ming Hua, would be the first to initiate the fight. She thrives when she is able to take control from the start and stands the best chance of winning when operating at a healthy distance from her opponent, as her weapon lacks defensive viability. Sylvar would be able to withstand the initial assault, but the effort would likely prove quite taxing for her, both physically and psychologically. However, I believe she would eventually muster the patience necessary to properly analyze and come to terms with what it is she's facing. Unfortunately for her, she would have to do this while operating at a deficit. She would still have all of her work cut out for her, and she would likely take a few good hits along the way. However, her prideful and determined Cathar nature and well-developed physical durability would enable her to press on in spite of these setbacks. Realizing at last the inherent limitations of her opponent's skill set, Sylvar would dauntlessly retaliate against her dark opponent. Drawing on her passions to fuel her performance, she would push Githany out of her comfort zone, forcing her onto the defensive, where she was nowhere near as viable, and the fight would eventually and decisively conclude, with Sylvar battered and bleeding, but victorious all the same. I proclaim Sylvar, the Cathar Jedi Knight, the victor. Okay guys, as always, this is all just for fun, as you know. Please don't get bent out of shape if Githany happens to be your favorite character. This is all just my personal opinion and interpretation of the evidence. I thank each and every one of you for watching, and hope you all have a nice day. Until next time, guys. And of course, may the Force be with you, always.